Here.
Yeah,
This this has become home.
yeah.
I'm very fortunate to have it. You were actually out here, so you remember my space. It's not
Uh-huh.
huge. It's like about, I think, 7 by 12. But as a result of the virus, all my teaching now has gone online. That
Uh-huh.
being said, before I did that, before my live students went to either Skype or FaceTime, my teaching practice is probably somewhere around 30% live and 70% Skype anyway, or maybe
Uh-huh.
even 75-25. I don't know. I was telling one of my students last night, I said, if you were to ask me how many students I have, I honestly couldn't tell you. And I don't really care to know. I'm not thinking about the numbers. I'm thinking about who I'm working with and how my schedule is working. I have maybe about 10 guys that go every week,
Hmm.
and then the other multitudes are every other week.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so the space has become, like a little sanctity place for me to just continue doing what I'm doing. I'm very fortunate, because I started Skyping about 6.5 years ago, I think, somewhere at the end of 2013, where at that point, if you would have asked me to Skype, I would have kind of snickered and laughed and said, I don't think so.
Hmm.
And then when I started to do some drum channel episodes, and I was a regular there for about a year and a half, there was like a steady calling of people who wanted to Skype. And so I had to learn, how to go through that process. There was many little learning curves. And within, maybe a couple of years, because I say it was challenging to put headphones on and be super intense and bring the quality of my room, my space through the internet.
Hmm.
Now it's no problem. It's like just easy as what I would do here live. The only thing I can't do is take my elbow and hit you in the side when you get something wrong or right. If I
Yeah.
could create an app where I could push a button on my keyboard and like a little elbow snapped out of your computer and hit you in the elbow, then I'm hitting 100%. But that's it. So the space is very, small, 7 by 12. I've got my drum set here. I usually sit here with a practice pad. I always teach with headphones on to keep a really clear focus and connection, because this door out here is, sometimes somebody will come out, my wife or my au pair or the kids, not very rarely the kids, because they kind of know if I'm out here that I'm teaching. My daughter will sometimes interrupt. It's very rare.
Hmm.
And basically, I have an iMac that I thought was a more effective purchase. I'm not really bringing a laptop around, so I have my older laptop that's kind of become like my daughter's school tool now that she's out of school and
Hmm.
doing first grade via more online. And so the iMac was a great purchase because it's a 21 or 22-inch screen. So it's great for me visually to see everything. And when I'm teaching, I always stress the importance on the other end of the student's side of the coin is to get good, like either have your computer plugged in directly to your modem if you can, because then you get a direct signal. A
Hmm.
lot of people think, oh, I got all those bars of Wi-Fi, it should be fine. But if you have a house full of Wi-Fi um, tablets and computers and phones, and people are using them, it can severely diminish the straight signal, and you can get some knockoffs here and there. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so yeah, so the space has become just like a little hang, and not really much has changed since the virus has hit. Because, as I said, I'm really teaching here and very blessed. Most of my students are older, well established working folks or professionals, but in most cases they have another job that they supplement their income with, and they're just passionate drummers and they want to extend their shelf life, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, let me go ahead and introduce you.
Okay.
So I'm talking with Bruce Becker, who is a teacher of mine. Even though it's been a while since I've studied with you, Bruce, I still consider you a teacher.
Thank you.
And we met. The first time we met was in person. I was in LA for NAM.
Yeah, Nam, was that like 2015 or so, or 14, 15?
Yeah, I think it was 15 probably. And when we started talking, I started realizing that I needed to study with you. And also I bought your DVD and
Oh
I
yeah.
watched that, and then I really realized that I needed to study with you. And so we have never done an in-person lesson, but for about a year, I studied with Bruce, and I have to say, I think you're as effective as any teacher could be online, and I think it's probably just about as effective as if we met in person. As far as what I've seen in the improvement for myself, just because your clarity in what we're working on, and you demonstrate it in a way that, and we can talk more about how you do that. But
Sure.
also, there's a lot of different things I want to talk about, just that are, kind of philosophical.
Sure.
But Bruce studied for many years with Freddie Gruber, who was a very well known educator, taught many drummers of some of the bands that everybody's heard, and then also you also were friends with Mr. Chapin as well. Is that right?
I actually studied a little bit with Jimmy when I lived over in Europe. When I was there,
Uh,
that's where I kind of became more friendly with Jimmy, because he used to travel quite a bit and do a lot of traveling through the Netherlands and Germany and other places. And I lived in Belgium, so I was kind of moving around quite a bit. And whenever he was there, I certainly made time to hang with him. He was always there for the Frankfurt Music Messe,
uh,
the big music fair like the NAMM show.
okay.
He would always be there for the Koblenz Drum Festival that ran for several years. I don't remember exactly. And I was there at certain clinics that he did, and we would hang. And then I was also like his ear to his grievances about Freddie sometimes, as well as I was the ear to Freddie for Freddie's grievances against Jimmy. Those guys sometimes would kind of be, I guess, a little combative, kind of like Oscar and Felix of the Odd Couple. But at the same
Tug of
time,
war there.
yeah, and sometimes they would get together and they would be like old chums, like there was no big deal. But they would both pull on me quite a bit. But I hung with Jimmy because I wanted to get the essence of what he was teaching, and who better to get it from than him. Now, Freddie actually studied with Jimmy when he was a young guy. And that was one of the rubs, because he never really mentioned that. He never gave Jimmy any credit.
Okay.
And Freddie had his take on the Moeller method. He never called it the Moeller method. My interpretation was basically the hybrid of what I got from Freddie, the information I got from Jimmy, and then years of playing, and then really years of teaching too, to kind of suss out some more little nuances that I found to be valuable to add to the mix.
Yeah. And how many years have you been teaching though?
This would be my 38th year.
Okay.
If I go back, like I was just telling somebody, like I used 1982 as a marking point because I started to teach at the Music Stop, which ironically was where Freddie started his teaching, basically.
Okay.
But there was students before that. I had a few students all the way back to like the late 70s. I was already teaching when I was a young guy. Just had a desire to teach. I think I knew how to share some information even when I was younger, maybe a little more cryptic, but I could kind of get some points across. But I use that 1982 as my true marking point, because that's where when I started at the Music Stop, I was teaching 4 days a week. I was teaching a Monday, a Tuesday, a Thursday, and a Saturday. And I probably had, like whatever, 35 or 40 students in a week, or I don't remember, something like that. Mostly half-hour students. So, when you're teaching half-hour, you can have more students, and it sounds impressive, but it's 30 minutes goes by.
It's still a good load of students. Well, how did teaching? How did that affect your playing?
In going back, and I've said this in previous interviews, when I was a young guy, I already had like this penchant for kind of solving mysteries of technique. I was a huge baseball fan. For some reason, my parents would never let me join a baseball league, but yet I was out there with a tennis ball, throwing it against the garage door and trying to find the perfect delivery to the pitch and get consistently right by the doorknob of the garage door. When I was a skier, I was obsessed with technique and really working on getting my form and my skis perfectly together, and learn how to turn and navigate through moguls. And so the same thing applied to drums. And when I hit with Freddie, I was already playing for about, 6 years. I had studied first 1 year on a practice pad before my parents would relent and get me a drum set. And I showed the initiative that I was in it, not as serious as maybe I became, but I had the wherewithal to run through the reading books I was going through with my teacher. And so going forward, to like, how did I find the teaching thing? It just sort of manifested because of my interest. Because when I met Freddie, I saw some of the detail that he was involved in. I always say this, that when I hit upon Freddie, at which would have been late 77 or just at the beginning of 78, I think. It would have been the height of his teaching. He was in this one little house. He had already acquired like a pretty good like notoriety in the city here in LA, as quirky as he was. And so, you know, I would say he had really like hit his pinnacle. After that time, when he sold that little house that he lived in '84, I don't want to say it was like a severe demise, but I could see that the sum of his details were not quite as poignant as they had been before. So anyway, I always felt this penchant to be a, you know, like a soldier of Gruber a little bit out there when I was younger, because I really felt he was a benefit to my playing. So, you know, I would go around to different drummers that I knew in town, and I'd tell Mark Schulman, for example, oh, you got to study with Gruber, or this other guy, Marty Farah, who was a friend of mine from way back in high school.
And for those that don't know them, who are some of the people that they played with?
Well, Mark Schulman, notably, has been with Pink for like, what, 14 years? But before that, he's played with Foreigner, Richard Marx, Billy Idol. Shoot, man, his resume is deep. I know Mark for a long, long time. Mark's actually been a student of mine on and off for several years, in and out. Marty Farah, the big gig that I know that Marty did, now Marty's moved over to Maui and he's playing quite a bit over there, but his bigger gig was before the Eagles rebanded. He was playing with Joe Walsh and Glenn Frey.
Oh, okay.
And Marty's father was like a stupendous reed player, like a first call reed player in town in the studios and doing all the big movie dates and all that kind of stuff. I remember meeting his dad, and, you know, I didn't realize how, you know, ever present his father was at that time. And so anyway, those two guys, and then there was other guys that I would knock around and go like, you got to study with Gruber. So, you know, when I hit the music stop, essentially I was just kind of regurgitating what I had. One of my early students would have been Glenn Sobel. Glenn studied with me for, I don't know, almost maybe 2 years or a year and a half back then. And so he was already a serious-minded kid. And if anybody doesn't know Glenn has currently been with Alice Cooper now for about, I think, 8 or 9 years. And through that has gotten the opportunity to play with a plethora of artists through the Hollywood Vampires, that, you know, including Johnny Depp and Alice Cooper. I think Joe Perry's a part of that.
Okay.
And so Glenn was one of my early students, and I kind of, again, tried to regurgitate and impart what I knew. Well, I had a good recall for what I was doing. I just don't think my, what do I want to say? Like, it's developed, like it's way beyond that now. I mean, it's, you know, in other words, it started like you're imitating sort of what you see, kind of processing. And then eventually you start to make some connections through playing. You know, playing is really where it's at. If you're not playing in terms of like, you know, musical gigs, you can practice and practice and practice, but there's interplay that comes through, and certain settings of like acoustic nightmares when you walk into a room, or working with people, interacting with people. And you have to suss out like what's going to work technically and how that's going to facilitate what you need to do. It's a whole different world. So doing thousands of gigs certainly didn't hurt my ability to put the narrative to a more clear place, and also being somewhat versatile in my musical background, because I was, you know, interested in a lot of rock and pop, but I was also very interested in a lot of jazz and world music as well. So it kind of laid a larger platform me to draw from as I was playing and teaching. You know,
and back to Jimmy Chapin and Freddie Gruber.
Yep.
How did their approaches really, when you looked at what they were doing and what they're teaching, were they really that different? Or
oh yeah,
were they,
yeah,
they
yeah,
really were.
Yeah, I mean, Freddie had like a pretty intricate detail in what he did. Now, I don't want to say Jimmy wasn't detailed, but the detail that Freddie had was just astounding. And, you know, I stayed with him for well longer than probably, I would say, I can throw this out there, but I can't corroborate this with any statistics. But, you know, 95% of the guys would be there for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and then they'd move along. I was there for 7.5. And when I look back, I kind of see that Freddie had to dig deep to find specific things that were engaging for me, because, you know, at that point in time, then it became more personalized, because we had gone through many of the technical exploits. Although we would still revisit certain things, we were on our way to more conceptual modes of thinking about how time is played and feel and other nuance that you wouldn't necessarily get in the earlier stages of developing technique. You know, you can only absorb so much, and at some point, you know, you have to string it along. So that's one of the things I think maybe many people don't know about me. I have tons of conceptual things that I do that would be included in the technical game, but to extend beyond, to add value for growth, for, you know, whether it's odd phrasing or concepts of how to play rock and roll, not just the beat that you're playing, but the conceptual approach of placing time and how you can interact with using your weight for timekeeping for the bass drum and stuff like that. But I can't speak all the way about Jimmy's details because I didn't dig in so deep with him. Mm-hmm. You know, it would be spending an afternoon watching him do a clinic and then maybe having a dinner with him and sitting and chatting it up a little bit, you know, or at the Frankfurt Music Fair, him pulling me aside and going, listen, Bruce, you know, and he would go, when you do it this way, you know, and he would, like, you know, and he was a giving fellow. You got to really honor that he was really passionate about what he did and was very ever present. I mean, he really kept a pretty monstrous schedule, as I could see, clinicking all over Europe. And this guy was relentless, man. He'd like wake up sometimes, go to a train station and wait to take a train like at night so that he didn't have to take a hotel and be sitting in the train station with a practice pad and play. You know,
wow.
Pretty cool.
And this was as he was older as well. This is
Jimmy Chapin. He probably had to be in his 70s at that point in the 90s. I'm trying to think that Jimmy was born, I think, in 1919, or I have to look back at the Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. So, you know, 70 years would have put him in like 1989. Yeah, he was in his 70s when I really got to know him better in the 90s. You know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you have worked with some very notable students as well, such as David Garibaldi and Glenn Sobel, yeah, who you mentioned. What is there any difference working with, you know, someone who is not necessarily having anything to do with them being known, but more just playing at a really high level? Is there a difference in teaching someone like that?
You know, you take into consideration where they're coming from conceptually. So you can maybe tailor the conversation in a different mode. But, you know, in terms of like detailing and working on technical insights and putting together things, one thing is, you know, that I've really learned to do, and I've really gotten that skill sharpened to a really fine point, is my observation skills. Second to that are my directive or narrative skills, the ability to speak it out in multiple different ways to make sure that I'm reading or speaking clearly to the receiving person. And so, you know, with a guy that's a higher level player, I take into consideration and try to get to know everybody, so I get a better perspective of where they're coming from musically, how it is they learn, because different people have different learning processes, and you have to kind of suss out, like, is this guy more of a cerebral guy? Is he kind of an intuitive guy? Does he have really keen ears? Is he a good observationalist? And all those things take into consideration how you send out the information. But in the deeper picture, how I would frame it is, no, there's not a lot of difference. You know, I still speak out what I'm doing. I look at everybody as sort of a blank canvas, and I just start to paint. Now, there might be things on that canvas that I see that, oh, no, I don't need blue here. I need to use green and yellow. And so, and you know, and I try to be firm with what I know. Like, in other words, it could be very easy to get sort of mixed up in the idea of like, hey, here's a guy, he's so high profile that I want to kind of ingratiate myself with him a little bit more than really standing back and going, no, I want to bring forward some of the highlights of what I know I can do. Mm-hmm. And that was a balance at first. And fortunately, with David Garibaldi, I already met him in 2012, and we engaged. He took 3 lessons from me.
And for those people that don't know, David Garibaldi is known to be an innovator on the drum set, played with a band called Tower of Power.
Right. And I call him the architect of modern funk drumming.
Yeah. I
mean, there's nobody that we can look back to that has as much of an influence on all the people that followed him. I mean,
so a lot of people will talk about linear drumming and will refer to David Garibaldi.
Yeah. So when I met him in 2012, I already kind of felt, all right, you know, it took me a minute because I remember sitting at him with one lesson and kind of almost feeling like dizzy and going like, geez, you're my hero, you know. But so when he called me back in 2017, this was post his accident.
Oh, okay.
And so if people don't know, you know, he was struck by a train, and not struck by a train in a car. He was physically struck by a train along with the bass player of Tower of Power, Mark van Wageningen. And that was really debilitating. You know, he suffered traumatic brain injury and I think some facial fractures and stuff like that. I never asked him all the full details, but, you know, he intimated a lot of different things. But he had, I had reached out just to, send him my best wishes. And he had reached out maybe about 5 months later after that accident and said, "Hey man, I'm thinking about retooling up my technique. Are you into that?" And, you know, I kind of laughed. I went, "Am I into that?" "No, I'm too busy, man."
Yeah.
So I said, "No, absolutely." And it was maybe a few months later when he started to get back together where he could play with the band. And that was the sort of, that would have been August or September of 2017. And he was with me pretty much up until just the end of this last year. And then he felt, after this 2+ years, he felt pretty confident about what we had worked on and said, "Okay, man, I feel pretty good. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction." And kindly in a text, and I really, want to share this, he put, "Don't forget, you're still my friend and you're still my teacher." I was
That's
like,
awesome.
yeah, it was like, he's just a really great guy. I mean, I really have a lot of respect for him, not only, beating the odds of what potentially could have been a life-threatening injury or a debilitating injury where he could never play again. Also being the quintessential educator, because he's a masterful educator and laying out his concepts, as well as the continuing student of the arts. And at 73 years young, he doesn't seem to slow down at all. He's always on his game. And I even said, if anybody's going to, rebound from that kind of an injury, it's David Garibaldi, because he's so disciplined and so motivated all the time. And he does not, sit idly back and rest on his laurels. He's always pushing the envelope. And for everybody out there, remember that you can continually grow. In fact, most of my students, I would say, and I don't know the exact count, but probably in the 60% range of who I teach, those guys are in their later 50s or 50s to 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I found that the what I've learned from you, I can, it's a lifetime thing where I know that I can go back to some of the first things you showed me and work on those, and they will help my playing.
That's right. Yeah.
And just thinking about efficiency and when to use tension and when to use gravity or
exactly.
And,
yeah.
So that's so what do you think the word technique, what does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, in essence, that's your facility. You want to be able to speak the language of music when you play drums. So you need to have like a fluidity of from the head, from the idea to execution. And if you have some tension or some resistance there and you're not really get it out fluidly, then you might walk into some problems and wonder, like, why can't I play this feel the right way? Or why am I struggling to get this out? And so, there are guys, and we don't need to name them, but there are guys who are like very technically challenged, but they're so musical, their musicianship usurps their technical abilities. That being said, that doesn't mean that they couldn't stand to sharpen up their tool and smooth out the rough edges. But I don't make a big issue about it unless somebody comes to me. If somebody comes to me and they're seeking my help and guidance to kind of open some channels up, I'm all about that. But technical facility is basically your ability to use your body to speak the language of music and drums. And so again, if you're like holding the stick really tight and kind of trying to play it like that, that's not going to be real easy to play maybe some eighth notes. And so you want to think about how it is you're doing what you do. And I'll do the Freddie Gruber. It's not what you do, it's how you do what you do. And so knowing that and being around Freddie for so many years, I understand the value of the how to kind of open that up. So when I think of technique, I think of opening up somebody's facility and extending their vocabulary or their range in speaking ability, having a broader, maybe more cultured way of speaking when they do it. And even for the rock drummer, I mean, rock drummers kind of sometimes think like, oh man, it's just meat and potatoes, man. But you can make those meat and potatoes, not just meat, but you know, like a top sirloin steak with like the most awesome baked potato with whatever, you know, I put your analogy to it, and you can deepen the well of your placement of time and feel and touch and tone.
Yeah. And I look at it also as it helps you stay out of your own way and more flow.
Sure. That's
Yeah.
the other thing. True. Yeah. You sometimes get out of the, you know, out of the headspace of like, okay, I'm coming up to that fill and I got to play that, you know,
Yeah. It's going to challenge me.
Right.
What are some albums that have been impressionable for you throughout your life?
Ooh, that's a good one. Two come right to mind, like more in the jazz fusiony vein, and one would be Tony Williams' "Believe It," which I did not know the Tony Williams that preceded that record. I didn't really know Tony's tenure with Miles until a little bit later. Another record that probably is not very well known for many people, but was hugely influential on me, from a great drummer who was an LA guy, who also worked with Joni Mitchell in the formative 70s, was John Guerin. And the record is Tom Scott and the LA Express, Tomcat. What a great record. John Guerin was just a fabulous musician and really groovy drummer. Couple other records for like rock would be, you know, oh man, like Led Zeppelin's 2, 3, and 4. I was a big fan of the Moody Blues, from like, you know, In Search of the Lost Chord to our children's children, Question of a Balance. So that late 60s, early 70s period, they were influential on me. A lot of pop radio, but a couple other records that I would put forward would be Billy Cobham's Spectrum, Miles Davis, Nefertiti, A Love Supreme, Coltrane, Pat Martino, Consciousness. A big record for my brother and I would have been Pat Metheny's first group record, the one with Phase Dance and San Lorenzo, and R.I.P. Lyle Mays, who passed recently. Let's see, a couple other standouts would be some of the Bad Company material, Aerosmith's first record, great record. Then going back to like classic, like, you know, Wes Montgomery with Jimmy Smith, that kind of stuff. So, you know, that I run the gamut of many things. There's several things I'm missing out of that, but those are some highlights that come to my head right off the bat.
So rock and jazz have been a big influence that you.
Oh yeah, see, when I was a kid, when I went into the concert band in 9th grade, which would have been junior high, all my friends at that time, all the drummers, we all knew who Louis Bellson and Buddy Rich was. So there was already this sort of link to jazz. Now that was, you know, those were the drum stars. So did I dig deeper at that time? No, it was probably a little bit later when I hit 19 or 20. I mean, I had a few recordings of certain things that I kind of knew about. But when I was about 20 is when I really started to look back and got familiar with Art Blakey and Philly Joe Jones and Max Roach and Tony Williams. And then I was a huge fan of Jack DeJohnette. That's another record I would put down, was the record Timeless by John Abercrombie with Jan Hammer, who I think is celebrating a birthday today. And Jack DeJohnette. And then there was a later record that I was a fan of that same trio, but adding Michael Brecker. And that's a John Abercrombie record called Night. And that was a huge record for me as well. Big fan of John. I got actually a chance to record a tune with John for this record. I was
actually going to ask you about that. What was it like to get to be around and play with a hero, and how did that leave, you know, how did that imprint on you, that experience?
That was awesome because I'd met, okay, so I'll tell you the long story. So in 1978 or so, I was at Freddie's house, and it was one of these evenings where there was nobody else there, which was quite rare. So I was on a little bit of a rant and going like, you know, I want to play jazz and I want to get my thing together. You know, I just always wanted to be like a really proficient on the instrument. And Freddie was just standing back and looking at me and just nodding and listening to like this kid go on this rant. And he kind of calmly walked over to his turntable. And if you kids don't know what a turntable is,
they're coming back. Or
right. Yeah. He pulled out an LP. He dropped it on dropped the needle on the first track, and it was this opening cut on Timeless, this like frenetic tune, like diddle-it-doo, biddle-it-boo, ba-biddle-it-do, you know, and it's just like really up-tempo jazz, real free. And I'm listening to this tune for about a minute and a half, and I think my head's about to explode because I'm like, oh my God. And Freddie took the needle off the record and put it back down, and he said to me, "Do you think those guys are trying to make money?" And I just went,
awesome.
"What?" Okay. So years later, 2006, I'm working this jazz festival in Riga in Latvia, or actually a little bit outside of Riga. And the featured act on the Friday night concert was the John Abercrombie Trio. And that time it was John Abercrombie, Gary Versace, and Adam Nussbaum. Well, I had met Adam probably in 1993 or 4, and we hung pretty tight for about a week and a half for the Frankfurt Fair and with Freddie and all that stuff. And so my brother's like, "Hey, man, Abercrombie's up there with Adam. You want to come up and say hi?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know if Adam's going to remember me." And so I walk up there, and they had been traveling in, I think, from like Poland. And Abercrombie was sitting in a chair, and it looked like he had melted into the chair because he was so exhausted from travel. So he was sitting back like this. And Adam, I'm like, "Hey, Adam, I don't know if you remember me." Before I could even finish, "I don't know if you remember me." I was like, "Bruce, how you doing?" And a big friendly hug. So Abercrombie's sitting there. I go, "Hey, man, I got to tell you a story." So I tell him that exact story about the Freddie Gruber thing, putting on the record. And I give him the punchline. "Do you think those guys are trying to make money?" And Abercrombie looks at me wryly and he says, "Well, as a matter of fact, we were trying to make money." And I just busted out laughing. And years later, like 2 years later, I was able to tell Freddie that story. So Freddie, at that point, I had kind of cut ties with him. So he was a little aggravated with me. But we were at the NAMM show, and I was wanted to tell him this whole story, remind him the original story of him putting on the record. I told him the story, finally got to the punchline of John Abercrombie's line of, "Yes, as a matter of fact, we were trying to make money." I tell Freddie that, and Freddie looks at me and kind of drops his glass and goes, "Oh, back to the coda, huh?" So, but when I got a chance to step inside the studio with John, it was an honor. It was a privilege. I was, beside myself because that was one of my favorite guitar players. And so when I got that chance, I was really honored and humbled. I think I was more nervous before the session. When I actually got in and we started to play, I was like, "Hey, we're just playing. We're making music."
Was there anything that struck you about us playing in person, playing with him, that was surprising?
No, I just found that, as in the case of many musicians, he had a high integrity for what he wanted to put out. So the studio experience for him was, him trying to work through some of the uncomfortableness of being in the studio. Mm-hmm. In some settings, I'm sure he was super comfortable. In this setting, it was like, "Hey, man, we got this tune. Here's the chart. It's a blah, 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 blah. We got only a limited time." So there was maybe a little pressure on him for that. But he came through great. And I also, on that same session, I was working with Michael Formanek, great bass player. Mm-hmm. The other session that I did for the same record, I got a chance to do a couple tunes with Ron Carter.
I was going to ask you about that as well. Because you had mentioned his bandmate, Tony Williams. And please talk about Ron Carter. And he's one for me, also one of my favorite all-time upright bass players, and everyone knows his playing obviously on Kinda Blue. And
well, no, he wasn't on Kinda Blue. Ron Carter would have been like all the period of the 60s.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, he's with the quintet with Tony Williams, and Herbie. And
Wayne Shorter, and
so it was after that. Yeah,
right. So when I hooked up with Ron, that was the same thing. I was super nervous beforehand, but as soon as he came in, now, from what I understand from a few different people, Ron can be a little aloof. And at first he was, until we played. But what I tried to do was kind of not talk about how was it playing with Miles and how was it. I was talking about a couple of records that he had done way after that. So in the 70s, he had a solo record I think it was called Piccolo. And it was a quartet where he played like a piccolo upright bass. And the trio was Buster Williams on bass, Ben Riley on drums, and Kenny Barron on piano.
Oh, so was he playing more lead lines on that?
Yeah, he was kind of playing melody and kind of more featured. And so I brought up that record. I brought up a record that he had done with Steve Kahn, like I think in 1990 with Al Foster. And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, that record we actually rehearsed for, which was kind of funny because I'm sure, you come in and do a lot of sessions and there's not a lot of time to rehearse. For the Piccolo record, he said to me, oh, I have a bunch of outtakes or music that we never released from that same group. And he said, give me your address and I'll send it to you.
Wow.
And so like after the session, I'm like, so Ron, here's my email address. And he goes, no, give me your address.
Mm-hmm.
And I think within 7 days later, I had a nice little brown envelope with a CD and a nice little note from Ron Carter. And so I thought what was cool is, I guess I ingratiated myself in such a way that he enjoyed the experience of recording, because he even said, let's do it again, hugs Ron. So I think if he was not on board with the session and how it went down, I don't think he would have made the time to say anything. So
yeah,
that kind of gave me a vote of confidence and feeling pretty strong about what we did musically.
Was there anything about playing with him live in the studio that struck you?
No, he just has a sense of urgency, like he's right there in it, man. What was so cool about that record is this was a tribute to a guitar player who had passed away some years earlier, and my brother was asked to commission arrangements and put together the production and pick tunes. Mm-hmm. And he had a couple of the guys like do a little message to Attila Zoller, and Ron, I guess, had done a lot of playing with Attila back in New York in the 70s. And David said, hey, Ron, could you do just like a little message to Attila? And Ron did this whole Attila, like this whole beatnik rap thing. It was so awesome, man. But as far as the playing thing, it was just hearing that tone and that feel was like, wow, that's, what I was so into when I heard the Miles Davis stuff, like Never TD or Miles Smiles and all those great records of the 60s that he was on. It was like chilling.
Does it sound the same? Did it sound the same in person?
Yeah, man. No, he was bigger than life. And again, like I said, I felt probably more nervous until he showed up. It was in anticipation. As soon as we sat down and worked through a little bit of the playing, I felt much more at ease and much more confident with just going, okay, here we are. And we were battling with a little bit of the odds because the cartage that I got for drums were a little bit suspicious. And the studio was not really that known for a lot of jazz recordings. But the guys, they really stepped up to the plate. But the great thing is that Ron was in a good isolation booth and I was right next to him. So we had good eye contact and good, just what do you want to call it? Just good connection when we were playing. So
yeah,
but still it was an honor, a privilege. And, when I can look back, at least I was able to record with some of those guys that I consider my personal heroes. I'm sure other people would say the same thing about their looking back at the history of what Ron has laid down, or John Abercrombie. So,
yeah, I'm sure those were pivotal moments. What for your playing? What are pivotal moments for your career, teaching or playing wise?
Oh, playing wise, being in the having the ability to do my own records. Not that they were Bruce Becker records, but I am the co-leader of what would be called the David Becker Tribune, or was. I basically
your brother.
Yeah, I threw my hat in a few years back because I'm just teaching so much. There's no time for me to be traveling. Mm-hmm. And so we put 10 CDs out. That being said, we were able to actually do records when records had real budgets. We were with MCA Jazz for a couple of records. We were with the Blue Moon label, which was a dual label, Mesa/Blue Moon Records, which was distributed through Atlantic Records. They had some great artists on their label too. That was, when I was there at the time, always kind of looking one step ahead and looking over your shoulder and being nervous about being in that situation, wondering how did I get here? But when I look back now and I think, wow, we did some great things. We played a lot of great music. We were able to do that. So that was one highlight. Another highlight was moving to Europe and taking a chance at 33 years old and just throwing all my life here in LA down another avenue and going to Europe, whereby I was able to connect with this great Hammond B3 organist from Germany, Barbara Dennerlein, and I played with her over about a 2.5 year period. So, doing like the Berlin Jazz Festival highlight, um, doing the Victoria Jazz Festival, where with her, we were like the week after party. Like we were in the hotel from midnight to 4 in the morning. And the ensemble of artists there would make you shudder, man. It was like Schofield's quartet with Bill Stewart, Dennis Irwin, and Joe Lovano. It was the Pat Metheny quartet with Billy Higgins, Kristen McBride, Joshua Redman. The Becker brothers with Randy and Michael, Lenny White playing drums. Hermeto Pascoal, the great Brazilian artist. Bill Frisell's trio with Joey Barron. It was like unbelievable. And all these guys would be milling around the lobby. That was intimidating, you know? So, but awesome experience again. And then for teaching, you know, like the first clinic I did in Belgium was probably, I think it might have been early 93. And I did this store that was outside of Antwerp. And I remember the numbers because my friend Bart had arranged it. And Bart had this thing called the Drum Club. And he had a magazine. And they did some drum events, some drum festivals. And before they did the drum festival, well, they did a little one. That's right. That's how I met him. It was a small one, though. It was just the guys who were the drum club. It actually exponentially grew and became a bigger event for about 6 years. But the first clinic I did, I had 104 people.
Nice.
I still have the little outline of notes on that clinic so that I didn't lose my train of thought. I knew I could rap and kind of hold my own, but I wanted to have these notes in case I went off like on a tangent and went like, uh-oh, where am I now? So I could look back at
a
my
little
notes.
bit of a structure to it. So
Yeah. So some of those were like highlights. Coming back here to LA, big highlights, just teaching would be like, you know, being able to kind of have amassed enough people over in Europe to book my own clinics, not really reliant upon the drum companies too much, make my own happenings and get a chance to teach like a marvelous drummer over in Italy, Tony Arco, get to do a clinic and a master classes for Renee Kramers, who is in the conservatory systems over in the Netherlands. Of course, meeting David Garibaldi, that was like, you know, out of the blue because I got an email from him and it was like, hey, want to check you out as a teacher. And I'm like, what? You know, really?
You had been a fan before of Tower of Power.
Oh, I was a Tower of Power fan, like right from the 70s. Yeah. When I was hanging out with Mark Schulman and my friend Scott Klein more, I was probably hanging more with Scott. You know, he would be playing like Soul Vaccination and killing it. And then he could take the needle of the stylus, drop it on like the perfect lick for Garibaldi, and then listen to it live, laugh hysterically, take it off, and then play the lick note for note.
Wow.
So I already knew about them and was into them like around 73, 74.
I have a few questions about teaching and students. Multi-part question. So experienced drummer students, what are some challenges about teaching experienced drummer students? And also what are maybe, you know, in some ways, is it easier to teach a beginner who's a clean slate, kind of like what you had talked about before? And also what are some qualities of students that you have observed over the years that certain qualities that seem to lead towards more success for them, for their own personal development?
Hard to say, you know, in terms of qualities. You know, it's just discipline, focus. I'm a big, you know, what would I say, like sort of goal oriented to a degree, where you write lists and, you know, even though you write certain things, I want to be a rock star by next week. You're not maybe going to necessarily achieve that, but you put this standard of that you want to really excel at what you do, and you have certain goals. As you move towards that goal, it may change, but, you know, some of my students that I've seen excel are guys that kind of have that. Some guys I first interact with and I'm like kind of dumbfounded as to where they are in their head. And all of a sudden they start to manifest like a completely different persona to where they're going. And it's marvelous. I don't know. I don't like to be like Freddie Gruber would want to take credit on everything. I know that I have an influence, but I sometimes get a little bit more step back and like, well, you know, I kind of helped the guy along, but you know, he did it. But there is a what do you want to say, collaboration there.
Yeah, if they don't do the work, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Now going to like a beginning student versus an experienced student, yeah, sometimes the more experienced students have more reflexive movements that really need to be kind of curtailed and, set aside. Go, okay, do that when you play, but when you're doing this exercise, be super mindful. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that the beginning student's going to have such a clean slate either, because there are always challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not one to um, segregate and go, oh, you're a beginner, I can't take you. If
Mm-hmm.
I have somebody who approach me and go like, look, I've been playing drums for a year, or I'm a beginner and I like the way you teach, I've seen some of your videos on YouTube, I think you're the fit for me, I'll go, okay, let's get it together and see what's going on. And it's always varied. I can't really say that there's like an experienced guy is going to be trouble or great. I can't say that a beginner is going to be trouble or great. It's really always trying to work within the context of the individual. So I don't like to get into too much categorizations. And I don't really think like that, because I think even the most experienced guy can break through and make severe changes where you go like, wow, this guy looks so tight and locked in. And now within 5 months, look at him now. It's so much looser.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really too much into the, hey man, you're an old guy. That's why I get a lot of older guys. I mean, they really see the value of what I bring forward. And I always say to the older guys, I say like, I don't know, on my phone, I could probably pull up like 22 names of the guys that are in their 50s and 60s. You can call them up and ask them what they would say about my teaching and what kind of results they've yielded from just hanging with me.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's I think exceptional about your teaching is your organization and your process.
Well, yeah, that came together from, I'll tell you a little story. So going back, one of the things I did in Europe, I was asked to teach a drum department of a now defunct school that was patterned after Musicians Institute, that kind of school, because the guy who started the school was a early teacher there, a guitarist. And we had, maybe when I showed up, maybe 30, 32 drum students. And man, that was daunting. And so I had to really get in and kind of restructure how things were done, because the teacher before me had basically, without pitting words, plagiarized a lot of material and put it together as curriculum. And so what I was trying to do was step away from that with a different integrity. But I always say that 1 year of teaching was so intense. I was worth like 7 years of teaching because of the organization, 32 guys that had paid pretty good money to go to this school and expected to walk out of there, which is of course unrealistic, expected to walk out after a year to be pro level and have all their shit together. And I'm like, well, that's not going to happen. I didn't say that, but I'll say, okay, here's what I can do to like maximize and benefit your playing. So that was probably the first step in kind of organizing. Aside from that, in my head, I've always been quite organized. I don't say that I have a maybe like a, this perfect memory of every detail, but I have a pretty comprehensive, detailed memory of certain things and how I watched Freddie put things together and saw, oh, yes, there's a progressive way of putting this together. And through that stepping process, you learn that there are other steps you can take. Sometimes I'd be quite rigid with it. And then all of a sudden you go like, wait a minute, what if I did it this way? And if you would have said, do that way, like 2 weeks before, I would have gone, no, you have to do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the organization came through mostly of that teaching experience. And then through years of teaching, in the context of from the 80s to the 90s. And then when I settled back here in 97 in Los Angeles, that's where it really began, because I had these young kids from this high school, and the band director knew me from one student that was this golden student, and he used to send me students year by year. And my thing was, I got to get these kids like really burning, so when they go and do their jazz band competition, that they're competitive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you with the kids especially, you have to stay super focused, because if you're jumping around, kids' heads are already jumping around.
Yeah.
And so it really like rooted me into like, okay, we got to do this. Just stay with this.
Keep them on track.
Right. And once we get this done, then we're going to go over here. And then once we build this and we've saturated ourselves in the stew for a couple of months and we got a little concept going, we'll bring it over here, and it just keeps growing like that. It's like building a house, expanding.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that I think is very rare that you bring to teaching is, and also I think labeling what you're doing, being able to name it. I think that can be really helpful I know for myself as a student,
Yeah,
and I've taken some of your approaches, and they're not necessarily all the same, but like when I teach the fundamentals of djembe drumming, I'm taking some of those approaches and labeling some things, and just because I think it helps the student to kind of helps them retain it in some ways. I
yeah,
think
sure,
differently.
sure. You want to find like some verbiage that offers some kind of like actual tangible idea behind what it is you're putting forward. And the more connectivity you can put across through language skills. That's another thing. I learned to teach speaking to students that were not native English speakers.
Oh, okay.
And so as a result, I used to say, oh, I feel like I'm an autistic guy. Like I have this picture of what I want to narrate. I remember there was that lady, I can't remember her name. She was in the food industry. I remember Meryl Streep, I think, did a portrayal of her in a movie. And I remember listening to her interviewed. And the interviewer, Terry Gross from that show, Fresh Air,
Yeah.
said, it's remarkable how clear you speak and you're autistic. And she said, I narrate in pictures. And I heard that. I just fell out of my chair. Went, that's exactly how I've been teaching.
Hmm.
And ironically enough, years later, I have an autistic boy, but
Hmm.
he's kind of on the high functioning side. But my idea behind was like in speaking to European guys was not to correct their language skills, but to communicate, even if they spoke that sentence backwards, because it was a literal translation from German or Italian or whatever, I would just speak it like that to them as well, so that I wasn't going to be the grammar police. I wanted to communicate the notion, the idea, the concept, and get the picture across. And that was challenging, but I think really, like, again, one of the greatest advents in my life to learn to communicate clearer. And then, then you're here with just guys in the States. And then you got to figure out, well, this guy's got a little bit different way of hearing. So I got to speak like, hey, dude, not that I do that a lot, but I will, if something's like really like of the, hey, man, you hit it. That's right, dude. You got it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have just a little bit of time left, and just wanted to hit on a few other things. Um, so, I wanted to talk about your experience with yoga and how yoga and how that and drumming have gone hand in hand for you, and maybe how that's changed your drumming, and then also just talking a little bit more about the internet and teaching on the internet, and
Sure.
what have been some of the pros and cons of that.
Well, for yoga, I always think of one of the guys that I followed. I didn't study directly with him, but I studied at his studio, and I found a great teacher that was one of his students, who I found to be really an excellent teacher of yoga. And this guy's name is Ira, but he goes by Govindas, and now he has his own studio for many years. But Brian Kest was the guy I was studying with. And I would always think back to Brian of thinking of like, let's do breath linking moves, breath linking moves. Well, I already kind of had that a little bit from studying with Freddie, because the essence of everything was to be super clear about how you move. So my teaching approach would be to get a clear, zeroed out head, breathe, and watch what you're doing. And that's what you do in yoga. You breathe and you kind of stand back and watch your posture. And you're not looking to necessarily aspire to the picture of the yoga pose in 1 second. You're trying to fine tune the inner stretch and the inner relationship of how that stretch feels. Because you could be in the perfect posture. That doesn't mean you're in a place of feel. Feel is a different component. I would say that in my technical studies when I was a kid, I could play a lot of stuff, but I didn't have like resonate a feel with it. So I could play certain things, but if I tried to pull it out on a gig, I go, well, that was cool. It was in time and everything, but I didn't feel it. And so the feeling of how you feel in a yoga posture and the press of weight or the balance that you can fine tune in the breath, I think is a great advantage for any musician. It doesn't have to even be, or any human being really, but for drumming, because we're such a physically, it's a physical instrument and you're physically engaged. The stretches and the fine tuning of that can be so advantageous. You can really get out of the kinks, in your hardware a little bit from those moves. And in my early development stages of the development of the hand and the inside of the hand, I would call those like little yoga stretches to enact upon a stretch or a pressure point that you're not really familiar with in the development of your hand, to fine tune the inner workings so that you can propel the stick with with the path of least resistance. So that would be the thing on yoga. Okay. So to your other question regarding internet teaching, that's a challenge. if you're going to approach it, I think you really have to have a concept. In other words, you have to have a program that you can stand by. Yes, you want to have some off ramps that you can deviate towards. I think it's incumbent upon anybody who's going to be a teacher to understand that, understand communication skills, like develop good communication skills, know your drum literature, like some of the masterful books that you can tap into. And if you haven't, tap into them. Get like an overview of, oh, I can use this as one piece of the puzzle to connect it to this other book or this other thing. You're basically looking at sewing a nice tapestry when the day is done.
And you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel as far as that goes. I know.
No. There's such great material, but
yeah.
You could look at Gary Chafee's books. You can look at Gary Chester's books. You can look at stick control and see how people have used stick control, or Ted Reed syncopation, or Jimmy Chapin's book, or whatever. I mean, go on and on and on. The Buddy Rich book is a great informative way of just understanding some of the elementary ways of putting together rudiments. Then there are the what do you want to say? The aftermath of that, going through the Wilcoxon books, primarily maybe the 150 rudimental solo one, the All-American Drummer, but you can go through swing solos. The Nard book for rudiments, whatever. I mean, there's so much stuff out there for whether you're looking for four-way coordination. You can go through what Dahlgren and Fine have. Now, some of those components are rather dry, so they give you the opportunity to embellish and add a lot of color. And that's what I do. I've added a lot of color to what may be appearing to be some, I don't know, not really colorful material. Like if you think about how vast Ted Reed syncopation has been used, it's remarkable. Did Ted really know that when he wrote the book? I don't think so. Yet so many people have taken that section of the syncopation from 34 to 45 and used it in such creative ways that, okay.
Alan Dawson being a great example of
that. Exactly. So you can go through and do a little history of drum teachers like an Alan Dawson, or like a Jimmy Chapin, or a Dom Famularo, or a Freddie Gruber, or a Gary Chafee, on and on and on, and at least get out there and kind of know some stuff and be humble to learning, because teaching is the opportunity for you to get clear too with what your limitations are. Like, or if you like don't know something, you got to go out and seek that resource. You got to really step back and go like, wait a minute, I don't really know what the hell I'm talking about. So I got to step forward and get this together. But when you're in the role of teaching, and especially if it's an internet-based teaching, have your system set up. Wear headphones. I wear headphones, so I'm really clearly dialoguing with the person I'm working with. Have an intensity. If you don't like teaching and you're just teaching just to teach, then leave it to the people who really love to teach. Have a passion for it, have a vision, and know that you're trying to affect somebody. And then I always say, if you're teaching beginners, your role is to create enthusiasm for the instrument. And if you can do that, then you'll be able to capture their imagination later. It's not to browbeat them and go like, let's pull out stick control and let's do number 1 through 12. This is good for you.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to force you to eat your green beans and your vegetables, but you don't like them. It's like, no. Nurture them along. And also find out where their heads are at. What is their passion? Now, most kids, you go, well, what do you like to do? I don't know. So you got to get to know that kid. You got to joke with them a little bit if it's a kid. You got to win over their confidence. So, there's a lot of parameters to teaching. And then going back to the online thing, have your internet cable or your Ethernet cable lined into your modem. Turn off your Wi-Fi, have a great signal. Find out what works for you.
Increase your upload speed if possible also.
Yes, yeah. I use mostly FaceTime and Skype. I do sometimes use Google Hangouts. I've used Zoom a little bit, but Skype and FaceTime work for me. Now, there are issues. So I've been able to work through the issues with Skype. If there's a lag or a delay, my signal's usually clear. But if I see on the other end, because the guy's got Wi-Fi and he's speaking and then his mouth is moving and I see him moving and then I hear the pad a second later, I know how to work with that now because I know what I'm looking for. So I just want to see the guy move. My observation skills are
So
spot
you
on.
might use the visual, or maybe sometimes you might just use the auditory.
Well, it
Depending.
depends. Like if yeah, I want to hear the pop of the pad,
Uh,
but I also can see like if he's moving right.
the
And
ups in
so
the right place.
yeah. So I mean, that really doesn't upset me anymore. For most people, it would be like, like a cluster of like, I can't deal. And it was early on. It was for me a little discerning about, oh man, I can't deal with this. How's this going to work? And are disconcerting. Uh, when once I sort of got my head together and realized, wait a minute, I have great observations because I can turn the volume down and just watch the guy move and I see what's going on. I know what I'm getting out.
Mm.
I do want to hear that tonal quality because a big portion of what I do with my teaching is helping to develop a certain tonal quality out of the stick and the instrument. And that's valuable too. But again, those are some of the things you might be up against. And the challenge is that you are having a lag time. So if you want to play a tune together with somebody, you ain't going to be able to do that. So you have to think creatively. How are you going to do that? And what are the challenging aspects of technology of your recipient? If your student doesn't have like good speakers or good internet or whatever, you got to work with it. You got to try to fine tune what you can do in the parameters of that. So you got to think out of the box. You got to be creative and always with the vested interest in integrity and growth. If you don't have that, then don't teach.
Yeah, and you're having a system. I personally have found to be you're an extremely effective teacher online because all of our lessons have been online, and I know firsthand that your teaching has helped me a ton. And so, anyway, thank you so much for doing this interview.
Sure, man.
And and so Bruce has a DVD, which I highly recommend, and also a
Well,
book, which
that DVD actually is no longer available in hard copy, but it's just going to be secretly. It should be coming out with Hudson Music soon. We just chopped it up, so it's getting ready to be dropped soon. I don't know when exactly. I just talked to Rob, but he didn't give me an exact date. And then I have my book, Puzzles, Rhymes, and Riddles, which is available also on Hudson Digital, but live and real copies, hard copies of the book, you can get from me.
yeah, I need to get one of those. And also Bruce teaches online, so you have students from around the world,
I do, yes.
and I can't I can't I can't understate really how valuable if you're a serious student of the drums, Bruce can as you told me when I first started studying with you or before I started, you said stick with me, I can really change your playing, and it's true. If you really if you really stick with Bruce, and even if you have a bad internet connection, your drumming can change
Well, I
significantly.
always
So
offer these like video vignettes, as you recall. So like those little videos are like the bullet points. Those are like the highlights of the lesson. And we go like, here it is, 3-minute video. Here's what you got to do.
yeah,
And that's
and I learned a lot about teaching from you as well as from about playing. So thank you so much for doing this interview, and it's really good to see you.